If you're re-elected, which hopefully you will be because you're a safe seat, what will be your plans to help the people of the electorate of Fraser?
So I certainly don't take being re-elected for granted.
Yeah.
I think the moment that you start taking your electors for granted is the moment that your electors should find somebody that doesn't take them for granted as their local member. The job's just an amazing privilege, it really is. It's the most exciting and diverse job I've ever done. And you can do two things as a Member of Parliament. You can help to solve local problems, so that might be as simple as trying to restore a post box in Nichols, or there was an 82-year-old woman who wrote to me because she had difficulty finding a good gardener that understood native plants. And I'd just been speaking to the head of Greening Australia ACT, and so I was able to go to him and say, who's a good gardener who understands native plants? And she wrote back a fortnight later and said, he's amazing, I never thought I'd find a gardener this good. So you don't go into politics to find a gardener for an 82-year-old woman, but actually it's amazingly rewarding when you're able to help something like that. And then also just to contribute to the public conversation around how we transition out of the mining boom, the importance of education, investment. I've written 2 books in this term in Parliament, one on social capital, on community, and another one on inequality. And I'd hope to keep on kind of, I guess, being playing a bit in that space between professor and parliamentarian.
So I go to the ANU, obviously I'm from Woroni, and over the last 2 years budget cuts have meant that the university has been forced to make a lot of cuts to student experiences. For example, there are a lot of cuts in music school, and there were some quite big protests. And recently the School of Arts and Social Sciences has announced that it's considering dropping tutorials, which obviously would cut down sort of opportunities for students to get one-on-one assistance, that sort of thing. So it would be a big loss to learning experience, in a lot of students' opinion. If Labor gets re-elected, will we see further cuts to higher education, or less, or more money into it?
So it's important to kind of have the overall perspective on what's happened to higher ed funding. I don't think there's been a 6-year period in which higher education funding has increased as much as it has over the last 6 years. It's gone up 73%. So when people talk about the 2% efficiency dividend that's imposed, it's worth realising that we're having a conversation there about 73% versus 75%. It's also worth bearing in mind that we've increased the indexation rate. The indexation rate used to be about 2% a year, now it's about 6% a year. So the conversation about the efficiency dividend is a conversation about effectively 4 months worth of growth of funding in the university sector. There has been an astonishingly large growth in funding. Much of that has come by the expansion of universities. 190,000 new university places, of whom many are the first kid in their family to go to university. I think that's amazing. Big investment in research infrastructure, so the new stage of the John Curtin School of Medical Research, and the Australia's fastest supercomputer, which has just been opened at ANU. So I know there's always challenges for university management, and I don't want to sort of trample on Ian Young's turf, because we fund universities, chancelleries run them, but I'm very happy to stand behind Labor's record on university investment.
Okay, thank you. So I live in the electorate of Fraser, and
excellent, good.
I've spoken to a lot of people,
choice.
and you're certainly very popular, but a lot of people are very concerned that the rhetoric of this federal election, particularly from Labor, but as Liberal as well, like both the major parties, doesn't really represent their own values and concerns, particularly things like immigration policy, for example. So do you think that this is because Fraser is very much considered a safe seat, that the powers that be aren't really concerned with what we need because they're not trying to buy our votes, sort of thing? Or do you think it's just that major parties in general might have lost touch with Australians?
There is something that's great about the north side of Canberra in terms of the issues that people focus on. So one of those is overseas aid, another is climate change, and a third is refugees. I don't think it's a coincidence that when I look back on my predecessors as member for Fraser, John Langmore went off to serve Australia at the United Nations. Bob McMullen is now serving Australia on the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And I think that's because people on the north side of Canberra think of themselves very much as global citizens and worry about problems that don't just affect their hip pocket. That's one of the reasons why it's a real privilege to represent the north side. But I'm comfortable talking about Labor's policies in those areas because I think we have made a positive difference. Foreign aid's now 0.37% of gross national income, whereas it was below 0.3 for almost all of the Howard government's time in office. In dollar terms, we're now a top 10 aid donor, and I think that's a pretty proud place to be. The refugee issue is enormously hard. My view is that when you've got drownings at sea going from tens to hundreds, potentially in future years to thousands, a policy that says that anyone who can get a boat to Australia's shores can apply for asylum is actually a pretty inhumane policy rather than a humane policy. That policy is fine for a landlocked country in Europe, and that's how many other countries in Europe operate. But we've traditionally operated on saying we'll take most of our refugees out of UN-sponsored camps, and I think that's the right approach for a land that's girt by sea, because it means we get fewer drownings, and it means we get to contribute to this global challenge of millions of refugees around the world, and we're able to give some of them a place in Australia. But it's a fraught debate. It's, I've said before, I'm kind of uncomfortable with all of the policy options here, but I think we've arrived at what's the most compassionate one.
I'm trying to, I guess the issue is whether the ends justify the means, sort of thing. Do you have...
But I mean, it's about, if there were no drownings, I would feel entirely differently about this. But when you see scenes of young blokes whose entire lives are ahead of them being drowned at sea, a little 2-month-old baby drowned recently, when we take more people who arrive by boat on shore, we're not a more generous country, because the way in which our policies operate, or the Liberals or the Greens, is that each of those onshore arrivals means one fewer person coming from an overseas camp. So on net we take no more people, but we generate a kind of risky path to applying for asylum that I don't think is necessary.
Does the Labor Party have evidence that deterrence as an immigration works? Deterrence being efforts, like institutional efforts to limit the pull factors of immigration. So the push factors are the factors that forcibly displace people in the Middle East, like in Iraq or Iran, or in Afghanistan, or like in Sudan or Somalia. So the warfare or poverty that displaces people in the first place, and then the pull factors are policies that might make people come here. Does Labor have any evidence that deterrence works?
So you're certainly right that both of those matter, and I think it's frustrated me when I've seen Conservative colleagues say that what happens overseas doesn't affect who comes. But clearly what we do here matters as well. One of the useful pieces of evidence on that is when we began flying home Sri Lankan, Sinhalese refugees who'd arrived by boat, we quickly saw the flow of they were claimed asylum seekers, but when we did the assessments, we didn't find that they had a well-founded fear of persecution. So when we began flying those Sri Lankans back, we quickly found that the flow stopped to a trickle. So that to me is some evidence that it matters. Tony Burke's spoken to people in Indonesia who are now looking at getting their money back from people smugglers, suggesting that the refugee resettlement agreement is starting to have an impact on reducing the flows. It's desperately hard. I mean, Papua New Guinea is not a country to which many refugees would seek to go, but the alternative is these drownings at sea just continuing to increase and ending up with a refugee policy where we take no one out of UN camps, and the only pathway to becoming a refugee in Australia is to take a boat journey on which 4% of people drown trying.
But are Labor policies in this election a little bit too reminiscent of policies right after the Tampa crisis, when Howard was elected? So I think a lot of people are worried about.
I understand that concern entirely. I think there's a number of core differences on that. First of all, I think that what John Howard did of where housing people in Nauru was extremely tough. People spent years and years in Nauru, and then eventually a majority were accepted either to Australia or to New Zealand. We also had temporary protection visas, which I think are extremely tough for people living in Australia, and there's no evidence that they really act as a deterrent. They were first introduced in 1999 and did almost nothing to stem boat arrivals. One key difference between us and the Coalition is that we've increased the humanitarian intake from 13,750 to 20,000. 50% increase in the humanitarian intake, 50% more people coming in. We want to increase that again to 27,000. The Coalition, by contrast, would take us back to 13,750. So one of the big differences between the parties is if we got our way and they got theirs, we'd be taking in twice as many refugees as the Coalition would. That's got to be a vast difference in anyone's book.
Were there irregular maritime arrivals that are sent to PNG? Would they have avenues to gain citizenship in Australia or residency?
Someone who's sent to PNG is they can apply through the PNG system, but the clear message that we're sending is if you get on a boat to come to Australia, you won't be resettled here as a refugee. And we're trying to be as firm and as clear as possible about that because we don't want people to risk their lives.
Okay, maybe onto a new topic. So you're an economist by trade.
Yes.
You did your PhD at Harvard. So Rudd, hopefully you can answer this question for me. Rudd has announced that should he be elected, he's going to provide the car industry with $500 billion to the end of the decade, so by 2020, and then each year after then he will provide another $300 billion?
Meaning, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I must have read that wrong.
No, that's fine. But our economy, our entire government budget is around $300 billion a year. So.
Yeah, that was a really dumb question.
No, that's
Sorry.
fine. That's fine. This is one of the reasons I try not to spend too much time talking about millions and billions in public debate, because they're sort of meaningless figures for all of us. We've never had either of those numbers in our bank accounts.
Yeah.
And I prefer to kind of talk about outcomes rather than to say the government has spent this many million on this and this many million on that. Anyway, sorry, interrupting you.
Oh, I was just wondering, obviously if an industry has to be propped up this much, it's not sustainable in the long run. So why are we doing it, sort of thing? Is it just an effort to buy swing votes from the people who might lose their jobs? Because surely with that money you could like invest in renewable energy or like build a hospital and in doing so create both skilled and unskilled jobs.
Look, you're certainly making a reasonable argument. What the Prime Minister has said about assistance to the automotive sector is that it will be focused on high-skilled jobs, not just in the car industry, but in associated industries. And we know that cars these days are pretty high-tech manufacturing. A new car contains 250 microchips. And also the jobs are pretty regionally concentrated, and so when economists think about industry assistance, often we think about research and development spillovers, and we think about regional concentration of jobs. They're the sort of arguments that economists reach for when we're on industry assistance. And Mr Rudd has also spoken about the sort of pride that Australians take in being one of the relatively few number of countries in the world that can produce a car from scratch.
Okay, thank you. My last question
Sure.
is, what do you think, so Labor's been in charge for about 6 years now, and during this election, I feel like the Labor Party isn't really focusing on all the pretty awesome things that they achieved over this period. In your opinion, what is the Labor Party's biggest legacies and achievements under both Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd over the last 6 years?
So maybe let's start with the apology. I think it was symbolic but incredibly important, and went some way towards righting a series of wrongs, which we will be redressing throughout my life, I'm sure. I think the intervention in the global financial crisis, making sure we didn't go into recession with all of the scarring effect that has, and then managing to increase the pension at that stage and pushing up one of the things that keeps people out of poverty. We reduced the poverty rate by pushing up the pension. The seat on the UN Security Council matters because it allows us to play a vital role in the councils of the world and do things like getting my former boss, Michael Kirby, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Abuses in North Korea. A profits-based mining tax is a fair and a sensible way of doing things, as is a price on carbon pollution, both just textbook economics and good, sensible reforms. And opening up the university system, I think, is really important as well. The old system, we have broken funding systems both for schools and for universities. For schools because they weren't based on needs, and for universities because we capped places not just by institution but by course, rather than just saying, well, if more students want to study that, then we should make more places available. So they're the sort of set of reforms that I'm proudest of. Obviously, I could go on for another 15 minutes on that, but I think we've achieved an awful lot over that 6-year period. But you're right, we're not just talking about the past, because often governments don't get elected talking about their record. They need to also talk about why you should vote for us for another 3 years. So that's why you've seen Mr. Rudd talking about things that will happen in the future rather than just things that have happened in the past.
Surely it might be necessary for Tim to talk about these achievements just to rebut some of the coalition's argument and to sort of defend himself? Or?
It is important, and I think perhaps we didn't do a good enough job explaining why Australia took on debt in the global financial crisis. 2/3 of the debt we took on was just because when a crisis hits, your revenue falls. And the other third was because if the private sector is cutting back and the government steps in, you can help to save jobs. By not articulating that story as effectively as we could have, I think we've laid ourselves open for the kind of debt scare campaign the coalition's running, saying the sky is going to fall in if Australia has debt that's about 1/10 of our annual income, notwithstanding the fact that there's a bunch of countries in Europe that have debts exceeding their annual income. So we could have told that story better, and I think at its best, politics is about storytelling and continuity. It's about kind of drawing what Paul Keating called the golden threads of our history and kind of showing not only how what we're going to do in the future, but how that links to what we've done in the past. Humans are fundamentally storytelling creatures, and more stories and fewer millions and billions, I think, makes for better political persuasion.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. You don't want to talk about Omniswar at all?
Yeah, so you're a student editor back in the day?
Yes, 1993. We ran on a team called The Naked Truth, which was a name which, basically we came up with because we thought it would be attractive to students. So we did semi-naked dances in front of classes in order to win votes, and then I just had a ball as a student editor. That ability to kind of write on absolutely everything I loved, as you must find as well. And the 1993 election came up, so I, unlike you, didn't do the sensible thing and go and do a face-to-face interview with a local politician. I sent questions off to Paul Keating and John Hewson, sort of ranging from the sensible to the wacky. Like I asked them how tall they were and what book they were reading at the moment.
Did they send you replies?
I got replies like it was the night before the paper had to go to bed, so I had to fight to get the page back, which I'd already given away to somebody else. They were fairly eclectic. But Hewson's clearly written by a staffer. Keating's clearly written by him with these lovely sort of art and culture references kind of sprinkled through them. But it's just great fun. I would certainly encourage anyone thinking about getting involved in student journalism to do it, because I still find myself drawing back on the things that I learned in that year as a student newspaper editor.
Big question. Why did you go into politics, not journalism?
I think politics is a useful way of changing the world, but journalism can make a difference as well, right? So, you look at Emile Zola publishing J'accuse, you look at Watergate, there is amazing moments at which journalism manages to change the course of history. But I guess I was, having come as a professor, I sort of felt as though I was interested in seeing how I might be able to put some of those ideas into action, and I've always been a bit too much of a partisan to be a good journalist. I was born in 1972, and my mum had an It's Time badge on her protruding belly while I was in the womb. So suspect I was sort of labelled Labor from the get go, and you want to have a sense of impartiality in order to be a good journalist.
Okay, thank
Good.
you.
Thank you.